that had it was a huge economist.
Oh, I know.
A household name. So I think
Henry Kaufman. So
you embrace it.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Well, let's get started. We talked off camera, Peter. The minute Time Magazine or someone gets on the inflation bandwagon, we're back to 550 in like a month. What about that?
Well, that's just temporary. But what I really wanted to talk about first is the whole definition of inflation, because I think inflation is probably one of the most misunderstood words in the English language. I brought with me a Webster's definition of inflation, which properly defines inflation as an expansion in the supply of money and credit. It mentions the result of inflation, which is rising prices, but they're the result, not inflation itself. In fact, if you get an earlier definition from Webster's, it doesn't even mention prices.
Does this have to do with Diane taking issue with something?
Well, yesterday when I mentioned that I look at money supply as an indication of see what's happening with inflation, and it produced laughter, which I think is indicative of the misunderstanding with respect to inflation. Now, let me explain really how inflation has worked in the pricing system.
Because then I want to let it was Diane who was laughing, and I think she might be laughing again. I can't see.
Well, basically,
I did apologize for laughing, but the reality is that we can't count the money supply very well, especially in a global economy. Even the Fed no longer counts the money supply and relies on it as a reliable indicator. So although in theory all your talk may be correct, in application it's not very useful for monetary
it's extremely
policy.
useful in application. Let's go back to the 1990s. The Fed created a lot of inflation in the 1990s. What Americans did with those
asset-based inflation.
No, let me finish. What Americans did with that money is they spent it on imported products because America lacked the industrial capacity to produce those products ourselves. So money went abroad. That kept a lid on prices. But it didn't end there. Foreigners used those dollars that we created to bid up U.S. stocks. They invested in our stock market. That produced rising stock prices. That was inflation. When the stock market bubble burst, foreigners then recycled those dollars into the bond market. That produced a rise in bond prices. It dropped interest rates, allowing Americans to bid up real estate prices. Americans then used their added home equity to borrow more money and send more dollars abroad, which foreigners then used to bid up natural resource prices that were necessary in the production process. So rising stock prices, rising real estate prices, rising commodity prices are all a result of the inflation that the Fed has been creating. Ultimately,
wait a minute. With that said,
let me finish.
No, but wait a minute. You're talking about that being inflation for the Fed. The Fed does not fight asset-based inflation.
Yeah.
So it has come out very strongly in saying we cannot fight asset-based inflation. So for definitional purposes and for people in the market, we have to be very clear about what the Fed is willing to challenge in terms of asset-based inflation versus goods-based inflation, and they're not. And all this neat little picture that you talk about is almost absent of the fact that profit share was rising during the 1990s, as it has been in the 2000s, which tends to lead towards more asset-based inflation rather than goods-based inflation.
Well, first of all,
more inflation resistance in the economy when you have rising profit share versus rising wage share.
There's no such thing as asset-based inflation or goods-based inflation. There's just inflation. Inflation can show up in asset prices.
Not according to the Federal Reserve. And if we're talking about what it means for financial markets, you need to be very clear about how the Federal Reserve defines inflation, not how you define
I don't care
inflation.
how the government defines inflation. I care what inflation actually is. The government is trying to confuse the public. The government has a vested interest.
They're not trying to confuse the
Sure
public.
they are.
That's just ridiculous.
No, it's not.
This is a Fed chairman. Have you ever talked to a Federal Reserve governor? Do you even know where they're coming from?
I don't have to talk to them. I don't have to talk to them to know what inflation is.
You don't have to know what they're coming from?
No, I know what inflation is, and I know what their agenda is.
Where they're coming from, given that they're the experts on inflation.
No, they're not experts.
I mean, they're ones. Oh, they're not. Okay.
Let me just.
Well, then we do have a fundamental difference.
Hold on one second, Peter. Back in the 90s, if you used your definition.
That's not my definition. It's Webster's definition.
But if we've been fooled all along, then the financial markets, which value stocks based on inflation and inflationary expectations, and the bond market as well. I mean, how long have bonds been? You know, we had Jimmy Rogers say they'd never fall below 6%. So the entire global financial system has been fooled by what inflation really was, based on what the U.S.
See, now you've got it. You can get an honorary doctorate in doing.
Is that likely to end that the markets could be so wrong for so long?
Well, that's one of the problems with inflation. It creates malinvestments, it creates overinvestments, it distorts economic thinking, and ultimately we're all going to pay the price for that. But the U.S. economy, rather than being the engine of growth, is simply the engine of global inflation. And I think
wait a minute here. Now, you did mention, in terms of you're talking about, that foreigners somehow created the asset-based inflation. Okay, your definition. No, wait a minute here. Bernanke has done a lot of work looking at foreign net saving coming to the U.S. We also know that the real estate boom that we saw, the housing price boom, was a global phenomenon. And in fact, Other countries like Spain and UK saw much more signs of national housing market bubbles than we ever experienced in the United States. So,
that's true, but
this
remember,
was a global phenomenon. This was not a U.S. phenomenon. This was something that happened across all countries.
Right,
so,
but there was
again,
inflation. There was inflation all over the world as foreign central banks debased their own currency and inflated to prevent the dollar from falling. So inflation has resulted in real estate prices rising worldwide. I'm not saying that didn't happen.
Why isn't gold on an inflation-adjusted basis? I mean, even that market has not reflected what you would call 20 years of hyperinflation.
Well, it's beginning to.
That's
I mean,
right.
it rose from, it was $250.
Well, it's not falling back again as well.
Well, nothing
demand
goes,
from China has nothing to do with commodity-based prices.
Well, sure, but where is that demand coming from? We're creating the money that we're exporting there. A lot of the demand is inflationary. Now, certainly part of the demand has to, or part of the reason...
Market reforms had nothing to do with this structural change, productivity growth. I mean,
well, no, there has been a lot of...
The situation that you're talking about here sort of is devoid of a whole context of structural change globally in the globalization
no, there has been a lot
of the world economy. I just find it a little bit unfair to tell viewers that this is a simplistic way to look at the economy. Yes, it is.
It's not unfair at all. Sure, there has been productivity growth in China, no doubt about it. In fact, one of the reasons
and in the U.S., some remarkable growth in the
Well,
U.S.
I would disagree there. I think that's more sleight of hands for the statisticians. I mean, if we really had...
Excuse me, I'm from Detroit. Have you been in an auto plant recently?
Well, I can see what our trade deficit is. If we were so productive, why do we have a trade deficit? Where's all the merchandise we're producing?
We still produce a lot of merchandise.
But why do we have a $65 billion a month trade deficit?
We have the highest propensity to consume and invest of any country in the world. We've been growing more rapidly than other countries in the world.
You're right. We have the propensity to consume, but not invest, not produce. We're going to be sucking in
more imports than exports, all else equal. We have a more efficient economy. We have, yes.
We don't have a more efficient economy.
Yes, we do.
We have a bubble economy. We're borrowing from abroad to consume. That's not efficiency.
You know, I've been waiting for you two to get... You're not going to get personal, are you? You're just going to keep arguing the intellectual...
Well, that's why we're here.
Well, what's the point of getting personal?
No,
I don't know him. He doesn't know me.
I know. I'm kidding.
Personal.
We hate it when it disintegrates into that. This has been all. I like this has been perfect. Just what we're looking for in terms of two people, intellectual combat, more or less. And we're going to do this again sometime. But the real number.
Let's do it later in the morning next time.
remember, all the CPI.
You got to get the last word, Dr.
All the CPI is doing is trying to measure one of the effects of inflation, and it's a highly manipulated measurement. Certainly, since they changed it a lot in the 1990s.
What do you think, Diane? We'll give you the last word.
Last word is, it's by far, it is not a perfect measure. It's imperfect, but manipulated is a little bit too covert for me. The government just isn't that organized on this data to make it that covert.
They're all reverse engineered. But whatever it is, it's trying to hide or mask the symptoms of inflation.
And Republicans, Democrats, it spans all administrations. They're all
I'm just, you know what? I just spend too much time with these people to know that they're not organized to be that good at conspiracies.
All right. Thanks, Diane. Diane Swonk, Chief Economist at Mesro Financial. Peter Schiff, you're close enough to come in here, right?
Yeah. Well, it only took me 45 minutes or 35 minutes.
President of how much? Man, the inflation and what we send a car. It's been going through the roof.
I know, and they picked me up at